Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our first event of the year. My name is Rachel Stern, and I'm the director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. Welcome to The Pencil and the Sword, how Lily Renée put her art to work against the Nazis. This is our second event about Lily Renée, first and foremost because she's the only living artist in our Identity, Art and Migration project, but also because we're able to meet today the co-curators of the exhibition Three with a Pen, Lily Renée, Bill Spiro and Paul-Peter Porges, which originated 2019 at the Jewish Museum Vienna and was on view this past year at the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York. It is my pleasure to now welcome today's distinguished speakers, Sabine Apostolo and Michael Freund. Their presentation will be followed by Q&A. Sabine Apostolo is the curator and collection manager at the Jewish Museum Vienna, Austria. She studied comparative literature and art history. Michael Freund is media communications professor emeritus and lecturer at Webster University Vienna and writer and a guest curator at the Jewish Museum Vienna, Austria. Welcome, Sabine and Michael.
Over to us?
Yep.
Okay, all right. First of all, thanks for your kind words of introduction. We'd also like to add that we both saw the recording of the event last November on Lily Renée, From Refugee to Renown. And our thanks also go especially to Trina Robbins and to Adrian Gruben, who helped us in many ways get our show going years ago. All right, now about the upcoming hour. First, Sabine will introduce you to how the show at the Jewish Museum in Vienna came about, what led to the particular constellation of these three artists, and she will give a first insight into Lily Renée's art. I will then talk about and contextualize Lily's biography, and following that, Sabine will detail the reparative approach she used in dealing with both life and art, not only of Lily Renée, but also of the other two artists, Bill Spiro and Paul-Peter Porges. So let's start with your introduction, Sabine.
Yes, thank you also from my side. I just wanted to explain why the Jewish Museum Vienna decided to do this exhibition, Three with a Pen. Years ago, there was this vague idea about doing an exhibition about Jewish cartoonists, because the Jewish Museum Vienna holds a major part of the artistic estate of the Austro-American cartoonist Paul-Peter Porges. And then it received a large donation of drawings by the caricaturist Bill Spiro. And these are exactly the other two artists we focused in this exhibition. And so the idea of this exhibition on cartoonists was kept on. And then we learned through Hans Haider, an Austrian journalist, about Lily Renée. He did himself research about yet another Austro-Jewish cartoonist, Peter Gold or Golds. And he was for a short period the husband of Lily Renée. And when Hans Haider did his research, he discovered Lily Renée as a fascinating artist and recommended the Jewish Museum to look further into her life. And we did it, he got us in contact with her. And so finally, she became the third artist we featured in this exhibition. And here you see the poster of the exhibition with a self-portrait of each of them. On the right side, you see a portrait from Paul-Peter Porges, then in the middle, Bill Spiro, and on the left side, of course, Lily Renée. Now I will pass to Michael, who did in-depth research into the life of Lily Renée, which was not always that easy.
Okay, I'm not sure how in-depth this is going to be, but I'll do my best. Okay, so Lily Renée was born on May 12, 1921, in Vienna to a prosperous assimilated Jewish bourgeois family. Let's for a moment dwell on this, the time, the place, the family, because all these facts are relevant if one wants to understand Lily Renée's situation within the larger picture. So I'm going to contextualize briefly. Austria, let's start with the time and place. Austria had been a part of the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire on the map on the left side that had existed for almost 650 years until the end of World War I in 1918. Central Europe was then divided up into several nation states, as you can see on the right-hand side, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, etc. And what was left became what has since been known as Austria, that little yellow spot in the middle, left middle. Or as one book title called it, the country that nobody wanted, because that's what was left over after everybody took their share. Why do we go into such detail? Well, to help you understand Lily's early life. When she was born, 1921, there was still widespread famine in the First Republic of Austria, and the Spanish fever was barely over. When she was 4, a first economic depression and an enormous inflation hit the struggling country. When she was 8, there was the Great Depression that hit Austria at least as hard as the neighboring countries. When she was 12, Hitler came to power, and in a parallel development, most of the democratic institutions were abolished in Austria. And in the year after, in 1934, an authoritarian Austro-fascist government, after the model of Mussolini, took power after a short and bloody civil war. 4 years later, when Lily was 16, the so-called Anschluss happened. There is sometimes the notion that Austria is a nice little operetta country somewhere in the Alps, and where everything was fine, and then the Nazis came. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, because nothing was fine. Austria was in shambles and a relatively easy prey in these between the war years. Did all this affect Lily's childhood? We can only speculate, just as we do not know to what extent being Jewish affected her self-image and her standing among peers. We do know that for many Jewish families, religion and origin did not play a major role in their daily lives. We also know that anti-Semitism was not imported by the Germans in 1938, but had been a sometimes subtle, sometimes violent political and social phenomenon since way before World War I. This affected different strata of the Viennese Jewish society quite differently. The students, for example, suffered at the universities, and the poor immigrants and refugees from Galicia suffered also. You might all know Irving Howe's World of Our Fathers. Well, they did not all immigrate to the United States, but many of them, hundreds of thousands actually, came to Austria before and during World War I, and they formed the sub-proletariat in Vienna, and of course became a target for much hatred because they undervalued the labor market, etc. In any case, it could be that the Willheims, the family, were hardly affected by those anti-Jewish sentiments until 1938. At least Lily Renée does not mention such incidents. So that's the family, well, when she was just 7 years old. So on the one hand, we see that Lily Renée as a child did not have to suffer economically and probably not socially either. She was also, as might be added, an extremely attractive child. So much so that the family's dentist, Dr. Halpern, kept taking pictures of her, quite a few of them in soft focus and with Lily in dainty little blouses. Here's the example that you already saw. When we saw these pictures, Lily Renée still has a few, of course, Lewis Carroll came to our minds. And Lily Renée thinks that yes, Halpern was, I quote, definitely obsessed with her, but he never demanded anything or behaved in an unbecoming manner. Quote again, people have weird things happening inside of them, she once told us. Lily Renée was an only child, and there are two things that stand out when she recalls her childhood: that she was often lonely, felt lonely, and that she loved drawing and the theater. Sabine will say much more about her artwork. I just want to add here that Lily, still a high school student, was admitted to be a guest student at the Fine Arts Academy, and that she always thought she would be involved in theater and visual arts. Here she is around 16, a year before the Anschluss in March 1938. The situation of the family deteriorated very quickly from that moment on, like for practically all 200,000 Jews in Vienna. Just one little detail. Lily recalls that the neighbor's son requisitioned their radio because, as he said, the National Socialists needed. This may seem like a minor issue compared to the atrocities committed soon after, but the radio, after all, was the family's only lifeline to the outside world. I will skip this passage and will go right to the next thing about her. There's possibly a quite telling, here it is, a quite telling drawing she did while the situation of all victims of the Third Reich became increasingly difficult. It shows a young couple enjoying a carefree life on a tropical island. Nothing could be further from her reality in Vienna in the winter of 38-39. We know from the documents available that she was allowed to leave Austria on a Kindertransport in April 1938, a month before the age of 18, which was a prohibitive dateline for a transport. Sabine has, by the way, curated a show on this subject, which is still on at the Jewish Museum in Vienna, and she may say more about this later on. The parents of a pen pal in Leeds in northern England had agreed to take her in, apparently thinking she would be a good helper in household chores, for which she was actually quite unprepared. There is an album of pictures taken by and of her in Great Britain. And from these images, you might think that life there was kind of nice and touristy, but she was extremely unhappy by her own account, and quite obviously so. She had to leave her parents in Vienna. She was not treated well by her guest family. She hardly spoke English, and she hated the food. Quote, that mutton and Yorkshire pudding and all that, I wanted schnitzel and Kalbsbraten, which is what she told us about 4 years ago. Now is the right time to point to something that plays a role, I would say, in all our lives, and definitely and particularly in the life of Lily Renée. And that is the importance of chance, of coincidence, of serendipity. Not only was she lucky to have a family that took her in, but her parents, who managed to flee to the United States after the Nazis stole most of what they had in Vienna, also managed to contact her in England, and there is more serendipity to come. Just one last note about her stay in the UK. At one point, much later, there was confusion about her date of birth. The French Wikipedia, for example, for a long time gave 1925 and not 21 as her birth year. And thus the legend grew that as a barely 16-year-old, she assisted people in England during the Blitz, you know, the bombing of London and England by the Germans in the fall of 1940, and that nevertheless she was registered as an enemy alien and had to spend time under arrest. We do not know how this legend came about, but the fact is that she left England on a ship to New York and arrived on Ellis Island in November 39, so barely 7 months after she arrived in England, and almost a year before the Blitz even started. We are indebted to Hans Haider, the journalist and author who Sabine mentioned, and we'll come back to him actually for this information. I think that you, Sabine, will mention him again anyway, right? Here is a photo of her taken in New York in 1941 when she was 20 years old. And I think you can see why she was compared, not least in your event in November, to Hedy Lamarr. So Lily Renée was finally reunited with her parents. They lived on the Upper West Side, or as some of you may recall, the Fourth Reich, and they all had to work just to scrape by. In this dismal situation, something very momentous and again fortunate occurred. Her mother, sometime in 1942, saw an ad in the New York Times. She encouraged Lily Renée to apply and to come with an example of her work. By her own account, not only had Lily never drawn these comic characters before, she didn't even know what comics were. So in any case, she apparently quickly informed herself, threw a Tarzan-type panel, and went to Fiction House, a major comic publishing company in Midtown Manhattan. The rest is literally history, and it is our prime witness for the case of serendipity. Because if it hadn't been for the mother seeing the ad, for the Fiction House boss accepting her, for her colleagues recognizing her talent and giving her major work, for the opportunity to create some comic characters or work on them that became famous, if it hadn't been for all that, if her mother, for example, had seen a different ad, then Lily Renée might have become the art director at Bergdorf Goodman, who knows? This is by no means to belittle her career. On the contrary, we're just saying that she was so talented that she could have succeeded anywhere. And that, as she herself has emphasized repeatedly, she fell into this business by chance and left it less than 10 years later. So while we honor her, as the Comic-Con did with an Inkpot Award in 2007, honor her as a great comic book artist, we should not forget that in her mind, this work represented only an episode in her quest for expression and self-expression. Now, before we move on to her life after the comics, let's briefly summarize what we consider the 5 factors that shaped and facilitated her work in this business. Oops, that's way too far. Sorry, I forgot one. It should be somewhere, but I'll tell you anyway. 5 points. First, there was a boom in the comics industry from the late 30s on, the so-called golden age. Second, this business was concentrated in New York. Third, men were drafted into the army from late 1941 on, and women filled their positions also as artists and writers. Fourth, heroines, instead of just male superheroes, became popular. And finally, there was the motivation by Lily to include some personal wishful thinking, that is, to take revenge on the Nazis, into her art. Thus, the spy and superheroine Senorita Rio, that you discussed in the Ascher event in November, came about. So you might also compare it to Siegel and Schuster, the nerds who reinvented themselves as Superman, or more to the point, The Amazing Adventures of Kavali and Clay by Michael Chabon. Lily had been briefly married in the early 1940s, probably to get away from home and or to get away from the lectures at the job. She met her second husband around 1945. Here is a photo of her around that time. That is the photo. And we'll soon see her second husband, who was also an emigre from Vienna. Sabine introduced him as, what was his first name, Erich? Or Hans or something, Gold in any case. But he rented, Gold and then Golds, and he reinvented himself as Found Peters and led Lily to believe that he was actually an a Gentile aristocrat. In any case, they worked together on comic books for St. John publications, most notably on the graphic versions of the radio and film comic duo Abbott and Costello. Here is a cover. And as she famously put it, he drew the men, I drew the women. This lasted until 1949, when the marriage dissolved. For a short while, she continued at St. John and drew comics for Bobby Soxers and other teenies. Here are 2 examples. But as she put it, quote, 8 years of comics was enough. In 1952, she divorced Eric Peters, and a year later, she married Randolph Phillips. She calls it her first real marriage, and she's since been known as Lily Renée Phillips. What happened to this photo?
I don't know.
Can you see the whole photo, or is there something wrong with the photo? Ah, thank you. This is better. Yeah. That was them in the late 50s. They had 2 daughters, and Lily Renée Phillips, was now a mother, a housewife, and a freelance artist working on various assignments, and also on her own for art's sake. She produced book covers, fabric patterns, and a children's book, which she could not get published in New York because, as the publisher told her, it had more of a European sensitivity and was supposedly not right for American kids. This discouraged her so much that she gave up trying to get it out at all, until we heard about this and managed to produce a book with her artwork and her text in a bilingual edition. Here's a sample double page. Again, not quite working, but maybe, hold on. Yeah, here it is. There's something, there's a delay in getting the slides and the PowerPoint to work, but we managed. Okay, so this is her English text, her German text, and one of the illustrations of this nice little children's book that we managed to get out and presented to her on occasion of the opening of the show for her, because she was, and the other 2, because she was present in May 2019. Okay, she also continued to do paintings and drawings, and I want to show just two quite different examples. One is a cartoon without words, but with a funny message that could have appeared in an upscale magazine, trying to do your best to fit, to be petite size 32 or something. And the other one is also without words, and there's a curious aspect to it, not yet, no, there's a curious aspect to it. In the excellent documentary that Adrian Gruben did, Lily talked about experiences that she had had and could hardly describe in words because they were so ineffable. She talked about seeing the world with new eyes, like she had never seen the world before, and understanding that she doesn't have to be afraid of death. The filmmaker illustrated this passage with the following gouache painting. And from both her talk and her artwork, I was convinced that Lily was talking about a psychedelic experience, or at least one induced by many years of meditation. However, when I asked her, she said that she had done neither. This remains a mystery to me, and certainly not the only one, of this woman who once explained the meaning of her family Willheim, which in English means want to go home. And finally, one more link in her very unlikely chain of events. In September 2018, the then Austrian Foreign Minister, Karin Kneißl, gave Lily Renée Phillips the Gold Award of Honor for services to the Republic of Austria. Now, the Republic of Austria knew very little about her or about any services, certainly not after Lily had to flee the country. The real and just as much deserved reason why she got the award goes like this. The journalist and author Hans Haider, who we mentioned before, and who, as Sabine pointed out, had gotten to know Lily only because he was doing research on her second husband, and then was so impressed by her that she told the museum about it, upon which the museum decided to investigate it, upon which we could do the art. And in the course of this, of doing the research on her, I also met her and was equally impressed. Plus, both Haider and I happened to know the foreign minister, Karin Kneißl. She was once my colleague at Webster University Vienna as a teacher. So independently, Haider and I suggested to her that when she would be at the annual UN meeting in New York in September, this would be a great occasion to honor the impressive work and life of Lily Renée Phillips. The minister looked at the evidence and agreed. Now, if that's not serendipity, I don't know what is. Thank you for your kind attention, and now I hand over to Sabine, who will talk more in depth about the art of Lily Renée and of the other two artists in the show we curated.
Mm-hmm. So I start with a comparison. On this slide, you see two drawings by Lily Renée. That one on the left side, she did when she was 17. You can see how she worked on the dress very elaborately. You could say it is more the dress she is interested in than the woman. And her knowledge and passion for fashion was very successful. Was very useful when she had to draw Señorita Rio and other comics, as you see on the picture on the right side. So you can say also that her fascination with fashion could be the reason why it was so easy for her to draw women looking so confident and self-assured. On the next slide, you see again a comparison of two works she did with a time difference of 14 years. That one on the left side was created before she entered the comic business. The other one is a self-portrait with her third husband, and she drew it after she had already left the comic scene. And you can see how she adapted the style of the comic also in another direction and developed it further. The woman again looks so confident because she, although she is framed by her much bigger husband, because it's again the fashion she uses, as well as the power pose of the woman and the cool-headed expression. So fashion is the recurrent topic in the drawings of Lily Renée, and this is also true for her comics. I just picked out two examples, Señorita Rio and the Werewolf Hunter. But it's not only the fashion which makes the work very astonishing. It was already mentioned in the lecture in November that the layout of the panels is extremely progressive for that time. Even the figures step out of the frames. And you can see also the perspective of the individual panels. It's very interesting. It makes the comics extremely lively, and sometimes even transcending into a surreal world, like the scene on the left side with the salt and pepper shakes, in which some people are caught, and then the tablecloth is looking like a chessboard. And then she takes one simple square out and creates an entirely new space. So it's really sophisticated. And then on the page on the other side, you see how she uses the diagonals to shape the panels, and emphasizing this structure through, for example, the woman lying down or the wrapped curtain. An even more surreal world and also more terrifying world can be found in other drawings by her, like this one with the lurking creatures behind the door. Not that surreal, but still terrifying is her drawings about motherhood, respectively titled Dream and Reality. And this will be the last work I will show you by Lily Renée. It is one of my favorite works by her. And it shows herself as a girl in her Viennese apartment of her parents. And she drew it 14 years after her escape from Vienna. And maybe it's just a wishful longing for the past, but we know it's also that the past in Vienna wasn't that perfect. So we can be more or less certain that without the Nazis, Lily Renée would have never started to draw comics or even become interested in them. But firstly, because she would have never left Vienna, and there comics became popular only much later on. A real comics production never really took root there. Secondly, as we heard already by Michael, in New York, it was also just a coincidence that she started doing comics. And then thirdly, Michael mentioned it also before, drawing comics had never been her passion. She started to draw comics for the money and made the very best of it. For these reasons, her artistic career cannot be seen independently from her fate as a Jewish refugee from Vienna. And you can also say Señorita Rio is a perfect match and way of integration in a potential new home country for the still young but already rich in experience Lily Renée. The plot of the comic allowed her to fight in her fantasy her persecutors, and fantasy was always a refuge for her. And now she could also provide Americans with more stories about the justified fight against the Axis powers. But I would like to stress here that she only drew the comics. She was not responsible for the content, although it suited her perfectly. Today, the identity of Lily Renée would be a significant issue. But as far as we know, during those days at Fiction House, only her talent was the crucial point. Her identity as a Viennese Jewish refugee was a private matter. So today we can look at the story and on the works with all our knowledge and of the Shoah and what happened to her and her parents, and say, what a talent, what a gift that she was spared from the concentration camps, and what a story that she as a young woman managed to work in the comic business of the golden age and fought against the Nazis on paper. Preparing this exhibition and being confronted with with the life and works of art by two other artists with a similar fate, we came to question this intuitive enthusiasm. Because if you're really meticulous, you have to correct yourself, stating if someone is a good cartoonist, he or she should be appreciated for doing the job well and not for having been a refugee from Nazi Germany. Because if you don't make this distinction, you don't treat them fairly. This is, of course, true for every work of art created in the context of the Shoah. To address this issue, we came across the work of the feminist literature and cultural historian Marianne Hirsch and her husband, also an historian, Leo Spitzer. They too, in decades of research into memory and memorial culture, developed the so-called reparative approach. And in this approach, the two call for a conscious awareness for works to be considered and left within the original era when they were produced. Even if artists suffered a tragic fate, their work should not be seen exclusively from a post-Shoah perspective. Although it is clear that the story of persecution needs to be told too, but it should not necessarily be intertwined with the body of work. Now, we must say that this approach was originally conceived for works of art that had been created before the war, but we thought it could and should be also true for artists who survived the war and were able to continue their careers elsewhere. It is an indisputable fact that the work of the survivors is inseparable from their story of survival. But we should be very careful that their survival will not trump artistic creation, and the injustice experienced will not be connected with a talent for drawing. For this reason, we invited our visitors in Vienna, in the exhibition, and also in New York, to take a reparative approach and showed first the works of art and only afterwards the artist's life stories. To explain this concept a little bit deeper, I will now discuss the other two artists of this exhibition.
We might say that here we got all three of them again in self-portraits, right?
No, we don't know this.
Definitely Paul Peter Porges on the right.
But for Lily Renée, I don't know, it's more like this teenage comics.
Yeah, but it's, I'm sorry, not self-portrait, but things they did.
Yes.
Yeah, right. And in the middle, we've got Bill Spiro, and that also looks like a self-portrait, judging by the hair already. Yeah. Let's go on.
Yeah. So now I will start with Paul Peter Porges. Now you see him again in a self-portrait, a late self-portrait. And he was a great cartoonist in the USA. And some of you might know him, I'm sure.
And we had a show on him and his wife in 21 years ago, also at the Jewish Museum. Yeah.
Right.
He was fantastic.
And here I just show you some very briefly some works. One really early work for a newspaper for the US Army, then one for the New Yorker, one for doesn't work. Yes, for Mad Magazine and Playboy. And I just showed these works to emphasize his talent to switch between diverse styles and tastes. And of course, his sharpest weapon was for sure his humor, which you can find in almost all of his works. I think in all of his works.
Yeah, he was basically he was a fun person on paper as well as in life. Yeah.
Yes, and in life, he had more than one thing in common with Lily Renée. He was able to flee on a kindertransport, which was not that easy. If somebody's interested, I can tell more about it later on. Now I skip it. But he wasn't sent to Great Britain like Lily Renée. He was sent to France, where he first came into a fantastic children's home with very progressive caretakers, who established a children's republic. But then after the invasion of the Nazis in France, he had to flee again, and at this time alone, and he was also interned, but managed in the end to cross the Swiss border when he was not yet 16. And for that, he was accepted by the Switzerland. And then he was, after years of persecution, for the first time safe. After the war, he went to the USA, where he reunited with his family, married, and became a father of 2 daughters who may be listening right now.
So we hope.
And here you see the couple, Paul Peter Porges with his wife Lucy, who also was born in Vienna, and she was also in fashion. She worked for a fashion designer, and you see them in front of the museum, in front of the poster for this exhibition.
In the year 2000,
yes.
Yeah. Kind of reenacting their early embrace when they were young and lived in Switzerland. Okay.
Yeah, it's in Switzerland, yes, you're right. Okay, now I come to the last artist, Bill Spiro. And you see him here as in a self-portrait and on the photo. And here you see some caricatures by him. Yeah, and you see he was just a really gifted portraitist. He capturing the characteristic features of his subjects in just a few pen strokes. He was also a master of reduction, using the empty spaces as formal elements, as you can see it here. As a whole, you can say his work is characterized by an ironic, but often very affectionate view of the world. Spiro was much older than Paul Peter Porges and Lily Renée. He was born in 1913, so 1 year before World War I broke out. For that reason, Spiro was the only one who had a career in Vienna. He came from a social democratic family. And you see also in his early works, he criticized social injustice. He was briefly arrested in 1938, managed to be released, fled to France, where he met the US journalist and refugee helper Renée Willheim. I suppose some of you may have heard of him and his story and his great work for refugees by forming the Emergency Rescue Committee, and also his efforts in France helping about 2,000 to 4,000 persons to escape persecution. And Spiro supported Renée Willheim by forging papers. But in the end, he got arrested several times in France, and eventually in 1942, he was handed over to the SS and survived the rest of the war in several concentration camps. And here you see some of his works he did when he was in the concentration camps. Of course, he hid them, and they are really incredible and provide invaluable documentation of the time. He was liberated in Theresienstadt, and after that he settled in Paris. But his domestic bliss was really short-lived because his wife committed suicide some years after they reunited. Here you see a photo of both of them in 1941 in France.
Before he was deported.
Before, yes, and before he was arrested. He was arrested several times. Maybe he was just released once, yes. However, it is worth noting that his political body of work was really had a bite that, so his political body of work during the interwar period had a bite that was missing after the war. So now I came to the conclusion of our exhibition and also about this lecture. And maybe you can ask, so what do these three have in common? Why do an exhibition about these three? So obviously, all three of them were born in Vienna. They all demonstrated a talent for drawing from an early age on. They also shared the same fate as thousands of Viennese Jews that had having to leave their homes under traumatic circumstances. Their talent was useful both for Spiro and Paul Peter Porges during their flight. Both could forge their own papers, and Spiro also had to work in concentration camps as a graphic designer, and for that experienced slightly better treatment. For all three, it was easier to find a job in a new country because they could work successfully as freelance or commercial artists. Given their backgrounds, however, the trauma of emigration was also present in their art, but in most cases, only in their private work. This is true not only for Lily Renée, Paul Peter Porges, and Spiro, so our three with a pen, but also for a lot of for all other persecuted artists. So the three with a pen were survivors who employed their pens as a weapon. They used different methods to target their persecutors. Today, their work constitutes as a valuable documentation of the time. Nevertheless, their work should not be seen only as a record of their fate, and the three with a pen should not be reduced to human memorials. Oh, there's a... Okay. Sorry. So they should not be reduced to human memorials, because it was not the Nazi persecution that prompted them to draw. As children in Vienna, they loved to draw, and they also worked after 1945 on many different themes that are just as deserving of attention as their suffering. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you also from my part, and I hope there are questions, and we're ready to try and answer them. maybe Rachel is back. Yes, she's back on screen.
Yes,
So
thank you so much. So there has been quite some discussion going on. And
we have, unfortunately, not a very good connection. We just lost you this very second.
Okay, we can.
Rachel, we just heard you said you have, and then we lost you. What do you have?
We had a lively discussion already. First of all, Lily Renée has two children, Nina and Richard, and they're both in the audience. So welcome. This is terrific. Yes, and John mentioned that last August Lily was inducted into the Eisner Hall of Fame, which is the greatest honor for those involved with comics. There was a virtual ceremony at San Diego Comic Con, and her son Rick gave the acceptance speech, closing with a brief clip of Lily celebrating her 100th birthday earlier that spring. So I'm very glad that she received that honor. And
may I interrupt you? Can you hear me, Rachel?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
The problem is we have a somewhat unstable connection, so we only hear about half, but we also read what John Kwok wrote to everyone, the last August induction thing. As long as we are stable enough, we could let's stay. Otherwise, is there any way to reduce the bandwidth so that the becomes more stable? Not really, right? No, because there's no video anyway. So let's just try. Right now it's getting better again. So we saw this is a comment, right? That there was this great celebration and induction. And then Gisela Zerikir wrote something, right?
Yes. One thing, Michael, that you could do is close the PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
That might make some changes. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, very good.
So we already saw one note by by the daughter of Lily Renée. She said, thank you. That's the first one that we see here. And then John acknowledged that he saw Nina. And then we saw the Sabine, just a reminder, that's for you.
Yes. So great that Nina and Rika in the audience. Maybe they would like to say something.
Can they, or can they only write? They can only write, right?
They can only write, yes.
Yeah, but maybe they want to write something.
But yes. Nina has raised her hand.
Okay. For both of you, I really very much am interested in the question of how much the life story is connected to the art, and how much you can separate that, because you might know that Fritz Ascher wrote poems while he was in hiding, and of course that and other than that created paintings and drawings, and so the big question is, how much do you incorporate the life story into the understanding of the artwork. And Sabine, I really appreciated your comment to say that none of the three artists that you talked about really started drawing because of the persecution. They did that already, and that was a talent that they did, and it didn't have necessarily to do with their life story. I mean, they had this talent and they were able to develop that talent. And do you want to elaborate a little bit on how much you should be separating this story and art, and how much you shouldn't?
Yeah. Okay. I think this is a question for you, Sabine. We heard about half of what you said, but we think we understand the question. You let us know whether you understand the answer. Okay. I mean, whether it gets through.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So I think it's a very important question, but not so easy to answer it. So we did it for the exhibition. We just showed first works of art which in which you haven't seen any sign of persecution, because all of them did a lot, let's say, neutral works of art. And then on the other side, we told the life stories, but also including works of art in which they are recurring to their persecution. And for that, it's clear you can't see the work of art without the knowledge of the persecution, but you can make people conscious that maybe we shouldn't intertwine it all of the time.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. And by the way, it's very easy to understand you now. You're not waking up or anything. So
great, good to know.
So this event and our exploration of Lily Renée is within a larger online project, Identity, Art and Migration. And there we really look at which I think is a big point for the understanding of these artists also, that Lily Renée, all three of them were really able to find a language that was understood in their new home, in their new host country. Not only they came with the cultural background of Vienna and were able, for Lily Renée, was able to find a way to communicate with the American public by taking on a genre that wasn't really Austrian, not fashionable in Austria, and really not her thing, right?
Yes, it's also important to mention that Lily Renée and Paul Peter Borges, they were much younger. So maybe it was easier for them to adapt in the new countries and adapt also the new cultural language. I think it wasn't so hard for Bill Spiro either, because he was also during the interwar period in France, and he was really in love with this country. But it's the only one who had a career in Vienna, and you can see a kind of a change in his drawings.
Yeah, definitely.
How do you what kind of change do you see?
So it's not so he lost his bike, no?
He was a very engagé, very committed social democrat, leftist, cartoonist, caricaturist for social democratic papers before the war. And I guess the war, and we assume also his personal life story, I mean, the suicide of his wife, etc., kind of sobered him very much. There were a lot of depressing, I mean, to be deported and to survive in concentration camps, he weighed something like 70 pounds when the Red Army rescued him in Theresienstadt. So all these events, plus realizing that all his dreams came to nothing, the pre-war dreams, of a social democracy and maybe the Fourth International, I don't know. He kind of became, what it reminded me of, I guess some of you know about Roman Wiśniak, the photographer who photographed the Polish shtetl. It's late in his life, he photographed beautiful still life, sunsets in Vermont, I don't know, stuff like that, So it could also be that later in life, people were so tired of having to confront and deal with the real nasty stuff. Even his political caricatures were kind of almost gentle compared to pre-war.
Yes, you're right.
He had some. I mean, we saw a lot of them. He published in a Swiss satirical monthly, it was okay. It was more than okay. It was masterful. It was very well drawn, but the humor was not caustic. It was, if you want, almost a bit old-fashioned, a bit on the gentle side, but not having that battlefield spirit that he had in his youth as a young cartoonist. He was actually.
But maybe he had also to adapt to the Swiss humor. No?
To Swiss kind of style of humor. That's another story, right? But also he actually drew when he was still underage, and he kind of smuggled his drawings into. Right. He was like 16, and his father would not have wanted that. His father worked for a socialist paper, didn't want his son to work illegally at the socialist paper. Yeah. Now we have an unstable connection again. But maybe if you can still hear me, I want to apologize to Nina, the daughter of Lily Renée, because I said that Lily had 2 daughters. I mean, we met the son. We know that she had a son and a daughter. But you know, there's this basic law that everything that can go wrong goes wrong. I was thinking of Paul Peter Borges, and they did have 2 daughters. You know, so I apologize. And of course, there was the son and the daughter. They were both present at the opening, and we love to have them both there. And not that it's less of a virtue to have 2 daughters, but it just doesn't happen to be the case.
Yeah. And Nina just commented something I find quite interesting, that her brother and her learned only little tidbits of her mother's life prior to the marriage of their father, because she did not want to talk about the past. So apparently, yeah. And so you did quite some big puzzle to put that together, and everyone actually who researched her life and her and the way she came here and so on. So it's really a big job, because she still seems to be not very open about her life story. Is that true, or how did you experience Lily Renée?
Well, I mean, when I saw her, that was a year before the show opened, so it was in 2018, I guess. And she was quite open to talk. We visited her and spent an afternoon with her in her Manhattan apartment, and she was very gentle and entertained us. And we talked about her books, and we talked about her past. We didn't have the feeling that she would hide something, but we were also not very inquisitive. It's not like we were not sniffing into her past for a tabloid. You know, it was just we wanted to know the basics. And it's also a result of a very, very good and productive cooperation. For example, with the man we mentioned several times, Hans Haider, who had access and who researched the exact arrival times of the ships at Ellis Island, you know, so we knew for a fact that she did not help in the Blitz because she was in New York at the time, you know, so things like that. And she did not deny that. We didn't talk about it, but I guess she may have created, as I think Rick mentioned here, she may have created some of these misunderstandings herself, but they were not really relevant. I mean, they were relevant if you want to. No, they were not relevant. What was relevant was her art for us, you know, and the let's say the brushstrokes, the big brushstrokes of her career, and not the fine details now, whether she left in October or in December or whatever, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's what I also liked so much about your exhibition, because that was about the art work and focusing on their languages that they found. And I think everybody who saw the exhibition had quite some good laughs, and especially about the Porges, the drawings. And so John is saying now, I should note that we owe ample thanks to Trina Robbins, who first spoke extensively to Lily after being connected with her through Nina. Paul Levitz, formerly the head of DC Comics, and on a more personal note, an older alumnus of mine and Rick's high school, has spoken highly of Robbins' work in this regard.
Yes.
Yeah,
she certainly pioneered this. She was probably also instrumental in making sure that she was awarded the Inkpot Award at Comic-Con in San Diego. And yeah, I mean, and it's
she was also crucial for our exhibition, because we got loans from her. Yeah. So the drawings also, the drawings I showed from the comics, they're all
originals that she drew. Yes. Yeah, that she had. True. And interesting, one other little thing that we happened to get access to was these drawings that we showed of the concentration camp that Bill Spiro drew. we couldn't get the originals, but we got scans or facsimiles from the Imperial War Museum in London. And these drawings were given to the museum by the guy who who got the drawings in exchange, we guess, for cigarettes or something at the camp. An English prisoner of war who survived, went back to England, had these drawings, and then at one point apparently decided they're useful as, you know, museum pieces, and gave them to the Imperial War Museum. And by chance, and I guess it may have had to do with either the nephew in Stockholm or the daughter in Paris. But it was it's always serendipitous again. It's another example of serendipity. You know, we happen to see it. You remember better how we got to these drawings. It's also a little bit
sad because Bill Spiro, as far as we know, he didn't know this. And when he was liberated in Theresienstadt, he still had some drawings by him, and then they were destroyed from the.
And he didn't know that they were were saved.
And he was very sad that his drawings were destroyed, and very probably he didn't know that some of them survived.
So, yeah.
Maybe he saw it.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I love that. that.
And one of the two daughters, they were two daughters of Pepe, as he used to always call himself, Paul Peter Porges. She also wrote something that maybe you want to talk about. It's just the final comment that I see here.
Yeah, she says, hello, thank you, Michael, Sabine, and Rachel, for this excellent talk about the three artists. And yeah, I think, you know, I think you're onto something if you say the age definitely matters in terms of adaptability to a new culture and to a new cultural language also in the art. I love hearing about serendipity. Yes.
It was also, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. And also the chances for employment, of course, because from what I understand, Lily started all the way at the bottom and then worked herself up in at Fiction House, right?
She had to erase the pencil drawings of the other artists, right? That's how she started. But they soon discovered that she was very accomplished given her age. And of course, she was not appreciated because she was only a woman. But then people had to realize that they had to appreciate her simply. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And apparently the atmosphere was quite rough in that male dominated.
Yeah. They were basically lusty nerds, you know, I would say. But you can read. I mean, it's really interesting because there's really an almost a parallel, as if Michael Chabon had known about Lily Renée, which he may have. But if you read Kavali and Clay and how the Jewish refugee kids tried to save people in I think it's Poland or Czechoslovakia, and already overrun by the Nazis, by doing artwork and trying to get them out and doing all these things. I mean, the description of how they write about what that business was like in the 30s and 40s corresponds very much to what Lily Renée has to say about her surroundings at Fiction House and also at St. John. St. John chased her around the desk. You know, she told us these stories, you know.
Oh, wow.
He liked me a bit too much, she said.
Well, I don't blame them. She was extremely attractive, you know. Yeah. So of course they did. I mean, she must have been chased everywhere. Yeah. I would assume. and Nina writes that many soldiers assumed that she was a man when they wrote to get a copy of her work. So. Because right. and there I think it's important to say that that a lot of the soldiers were reading comics. There was a big market for, yeah.
And she signed her comics as L. Renee, so she got fan mail. Mr. Renee, we love the way you draw women. You know? And that's what Nina just pointed out, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, Nina just confirmed that Michael Chabon and her mother spoke.
That's interesting. Yeah, yeah, I didn't know.
Yeah. So
and now John, who had written before, you tell us.
He says, sounds like the writers and artists at Fiction House were slightly older versions of some of my high school schoolmates. When Rick and I attended our high school, we had a relatively small female population. The school now has more girls than boys and is better known for producing scientists and mathematicians. And the question is here, did Lily ever respond to her fan mail?
I don't know, but Nina may know. We never inquired. I'm not sure these people did, because they got so much mail. If they had to answer all the mail, they wouldn't do art anymore, I suppose.
Yeah.
Maybe she did. Yeah. There's also this other book, which I think the title was Superman Jewish or something, about Schuster and Siegel, and about how in what kind of world they lived. And it again sounds a little like Fiction House.
Yeah.
Well, the biographies of people like, the father of Bob is Iger, I think is the way you pronounce him, right? The head of Disney. His father was in the comics business, and he was also one of these wheeler dealers who worked in the New York comics industry.
Yeah.
She said Nina just responded. Yeah, she responded. Yeah, she did later on in life respond to fans' mail in her 90s. Well, in the last 10 years, in other words.
Yeah. Yeah.
He waited a long time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. This was really, I spent so many hours in this, in your exhibition, and thank you for telling us the story, how this all came together, and for helping so many people discover Lily Renée's work, and also Bill Spiro's and Paul Porley's work, which I don't think was much known here in the United States, in New York. Here, Ellen is asking whether she ever got to see Art Spiegelman's Mouse and what she thought of it.
Whether she ever got to see what?
Mouse by Art
Spiegelman. Oh, Mouse by Spiegelman. No, we never talked about him, actually. It's funny. It's a good point. Because you might say, well, he was one who much later also worked in the same direction. Yeah.
Yeah. So
one more thing, two more things we want to add. One is that we want to say hello to all the people we know in the various relatives who we got to know, some of them 20 years ago, some of them 3 years ago, and we all love them, and we're happy that they are around and we're present, including my old friend Foster, who also joined from Berkeley. And the other thing, a little commercial interruption, the exhibition went really well. I enjoyed the work, and so did Sabine. And I was very happy that she invited me to an upcoming event, which we will do in coming May. So if anyone is interested in the development of the espresso coffee culture and how an Austrian Viennese entrepreneur played a major role in establishing a different cafe culture in Vienna, Austria, we are happy to have them visit our show in Vienna, and who knows, maybe we can talk about it with you, Rachel. We never know.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that. Yes, that's a very, very good, very positive outlook. And thank you so much. And
thank you
for sharing and for this wonderful hour. Thanks a lot. Stay well, everybody, and goodbye.
Goodbye to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.